Good morning. I'm Tom.
I'm Charles. I guess this is our talk show.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like a talk show. We, although we can't see any of you, which is kind of already a design challenge, but we emailed each other. We made sure we wore the same outfits, but we forgot our feathers, so apologies for that. But thank you to Jürgen for organizing the dance troupe. That helped us. Hopefully, you guys can see behind us a slide.
We're good.
So preparing for this, Charles and I have known each other for quite a while. We're, I think, kindred spirits. We've sort of shared some common beliefs about startups. So we thought we could run the next half an hour or 45 minutes just sharing some anecdotes, some stories about the things that we really believe in. Charles from the Kickstarter perspective, me from the IDEO and investing perspective. And then we'll leave a little time at the end for Q&A, hopefully.
Very good. Yeah, so we're gonna run this almost like I guess an intimate conversation in front of a couple thousand people. We'll see how that works. It's a little bit of an experiment. So I guess let's get started. What's our first topic here is defining the purpose of the organizations that we're building or the things that we're working on. And I think this is ultimately something very near and dear to my heart for what we built, and I'm sure the same for Tom. But there was a few moments and I think stories along the way for each of us that we were sharing and that I think are worth reflecting on. And for me specifically, plenty of moments of distraction when you're sitting alone or with your co-founders or with your small team pre-launch. These moments of isolation and the world is kind of growing up around you. Plenty of distractions. There's competitors launching before you, and I think the one thing that I realized in those early days, this kind of goes back to this idea of purpose, is really just understanding the intent or the language that I would personally use is the thesis of what it was that we were trying to prove or put out into the world, and that was something that we were constantly having to reflect on in order to keep ourselves on target. But I think very much stay true to what it was that we were trying to work on. There was a great moment where my partners and I were talking about a recent launch of a competitor and looking at and dissecting, if you will, what it was that they were all about. And there was sort of this moment where we had done this a few times in the course of putting the product together. And it felt like a heavy distraction. It felt like this moment where we were starting to potentially lose focus on what our task was. And for me, I designed much of what we had built. And as a designer, thinking through why we were constructing a certain part of the page or part of the interface, there was always something that I needed to reflect back on. And so I had written down what our intent was and what our purpose was. And I think it's just that simple act sometimes, those acts that are very momentary are critically important. And then you end up reflecting on that later on in that other extraordinary opportunity that you get, hopefully, when you actually get to build a company around that idea.
So just building off that, similar experience, but I guess one thing we would love you guys to take away is the power of having a purpose, because I think it's true that anything that you do that's worth doing as a startup is going to be hard. If it was easy, everybody would already be doing it. And the thing that sustains you through those difficult periods is a purpose. It's a common goal. It's actually objectives of doing something important. So I think Florian of Runtastic, who was just on the stage, is a perfect example of that. He's absolutely clear why he's building that business. He understands why he's doing it. And it was not an easy ride for him, but during the difficult times, it's that purpose that sustains him. I think one of the things that'd be fun to talk about is another truth is startups become what they measure. So most startups will have a good purpose. Most startups will tell you their purpose. But if they're not measuring progress against that, then they start to diverge away from it. So we just heard Runtastic talk about 10 million press-ups that had been done on the app. They're measuring the right thing against their purpose which is getting people active. So how did you guys think about sort of measuring progress against your purpose?
Yeah, so it's a good topic, good question. I think one of the things there's a discussion we were actually having yesterday, and it was somebody who was running a project. So maybe you're in the audience, and we were reflecting on analytics with regard to the site and for any campaign that's running on the site, and what do we give people who run a project? The easy answer is we could have given them a Google Analytics code. And we held off on that for a very long time because we felt in much the same example, we wanted to give people running a campaign that was relevant to the campaign itself, provide them some feedback that was distinct, less about traffic to the site, less about perhaps conversion, but things that were more interesting like refers and so forth. Where's coverage happening around my project? Something that they can then go back to and then read those stories and understand what the press is, and then build a narrative with their community. And in general, sort of open web log-based analytics doesn't really provide that information. It's just data, but what do you do with it? So it was sort of thinking about what are the actionable measurements within the platform, much like the push-ups piece. How do you build the right sort of momentum? And these are all very, very focused sort of design problems I tend to look at, right? What is the experience that you're trying to provide? Have you guys done the same thing? You guys have an interesting and similar platform with Open IDEO.
It's so similar. We're constantly measuring. We try and forget vanity metrics. So number of users is not important to us because our purpose is social impact. So we measure things that progress us against that positive impact. And the important thing is we use that as a decision-making lens. So startups that have a clear purpose, they're measuring against the right things, they should be able to say no to stuff. I think this is one of the biggest challenges when organizations scale, is they lose the ability to say no, and a purpose is a gateway to do that.
There was an interesting, this is maybe slightly off our own personal topics, but reflective of the general kind of conversation. There was I remember a debate about an iPhone ripoff. So somebody, a competitor to the iPhone, I guess they exist. And it was interesting because the way the competitors sort of put themselves up against the iPhone was simply around sort of options that the phone provided. It had nothing to do with the experience that the phone provided. And I think the general gist of even just much of this talk is thinking very, very specifically about not the gadgets or the vanity metrics. I love that term, but more so the experience that you're trying to provide, and then factoring all of the pieces of technology. I mean, even we were sitting yesterday and were amazed by the exoskeleton display. I mean, that was incredible, right? And there was an application of technology towards something that had a very real and grounded purpose in culture and in empowering people, which I found amazing. And so going back to purpose and how we then apply those things that are around us, whether it's a notebook and a piece of paper or a MacBook or the technology that's embedded in it, what do we do with it? What's that intent?
And actually staying technology agnostic. Like too often, I think particularly our community, we spend our time getting overexcited about a technology and thinking, how can we apply it? And if you don't approach problems from the user, from the customer, you ignore all of their other ways that they might fulfill the need. Yeah. You ignore all of the other ways that they may do a better job than your mobile-first startup. I think one of this fixation on mobile first, it makes sense for many customers, but startups should not define themselves as mobile first. They should define themselves as user first. I think you'll hear this from us consistently. It's one of the reasons that designers play a bigger and bigger role in startups, is all aspects of a startup should be designed. And to me, certainly, I think both of us, that means they should be designed to maximize the experience of the end customer. And that's even true of the hiring, the recruiting approach. It's also true of how you think about your financial model.
Yeah, we've been talking quite a bit as an organization. I think it was mentioned yesterday, not about us, but in general, just this thing in the air of wanting to build a 100-year company, something that's going to honestly be bigger than any of ourselves. And I think we're lucky to have that opportunity to be able to do that. But I think a lot of the way we think about that and playing off of the people thing, and even just my own reflection of the years past in this world of technology and the internet, where we've had massive ups and much more massive, I would say, much more impactful downs, and not wanting to recreate, honestly, the mess that happened in the early 2000s, right? And so to the point about people, I think this what it ultimately comes down to, and we hear this term used a lot, but it's a term that I tend to gravitate towards as a designer, is this word empathy, right? This ability to connect with the people that you're surrounded by, that works both on both levels. One, with those that you're effectively serving, you're designing for, your customer, so to speak. And then as you have that opportunity to build a company, the same, I think the same thinking goes into it in reflection, which is you're building a team, right? A community, a close-knit group of people. I'm a cyclist, and so the sport of cycling is very team and individual oriented, but ultimately there's a team, and it's not always all that visible, and that might be part of the elegance of it. But I think we lose sight of the use of the word team when building a company. These are people that you're going to be around far longer hours than your wife and your two kids, and my wife and my daughter, maybe sadly at some level. But I think making those decisions is crucial. I tend to use, it's somewhat maybe a silly metric, right? I don't think it's a vanity metric, but it's, can I go and have a pint with any of the people that I'm going to hire? Hey, can I have a conversation with them? Can we do this in front of a whole bunch of people? And I think that's critically important, and that's that level of empathy. So when again, going back to this idea of purpose, when things get tough, starting a company is incredibly hard. And if you don't have empathy for the person at the other end of the table, whether it's internal or the people that you're working for, I don't even want to know what that looks like. That's got to be hard. That makes it harder. So how do you avoid or minimize the risk of those difficult times that you're going to potentially run through?
So I agree. Like in all three of the companies I've done, I've had very bad times, and it's the purpose that sustained me. And I worry actually that we over-glamorize the pivot at the moment. And so as soon as it gets difficult and you start really getting to the crux of the issue and where the value is created, people pivot away from the problem. And it's false progress. And most of us, I mean, many of the people in this room will have started their business to scratch their own itch. They'll have empathy for the user because they are the user. But a question I'd love to hear your view on is, as we grow our businesses, like as I'm scaling my team, it's very difficult to only hire people that have complete empathy for the end customer. And one of the things that scares me most, I'm sure many of you have seen it, is when companies get really big, they often fall out of love with the customer. And I would say if there's one thing that signals a company that's going to go down, it's an organization that does not love their customer anymore. They can't have the empathy that Charles is talking about. So as you grew Kickstarter to what, 70 people?
Yeah, we're just shy of 70.
So have you kept the empathy so that everyone's still in love with the people that run projects?
Yeah, so it's only 70. It's actually very touchable, right? And so one of the things that there's a point you made earlier, which I think was interesting, I was gonna jump on, which was as the platform scales, right? And so where we started as an organization, as three individuals with an intent and a purpose. Our purpose was really to serve artists that were around us. We come from sort of the culture of creators and artists and designers, and we wanted to create a platform for independence so they could sort of write their own script, right? And as we the term creator and even artist is I think a challenging one and a broad one, right? And with that, our community grew, and so there were communities that found an appreciation for the platform that we didn't come from per se. And so what we've done there is, I think there's one is finding a level of empathy. It's one reaching out and talking to them, having a level of empathy with the same intent, understanding that they might be coming from a different script or a different part of the world or a different industry, solving a different problem. But at the end of the day, they're there for the same reason. And so if you get back to that, what is their purpose? What is their intent? I think that you can still retain that level of empathy. And then the other side is just doing research, being out there, not just staying holed up in your office. I think one of the things that I've learned over the last 7 years doing this is getting out of the office, get up, walk around, get outside, get connected back to the world.
Steve Blank says the answer is not in the building, and it's absolutely true. Get out there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that is, you could even expand on that, right? In our little world as designers, right? I think getting out of the bubble of design and reaching across the table. Cyril was talking about this in some form yesterday in terms of your relationship to the factory, right? I sort of take that to heart and say my relationship with our developers, my relationship with our support team that then is our first line of defense with those having issues with the site. That's another level of empathy, and so it's empathy all around. It's not specific to design, but I think it is very specific to building a company and putting a product out there that is ultimately not going to be used particularly by you. You have this initial idea, but once you put it out in the world, it kind of starts to take a life of its own.
So there's two things that I do with my teams that I hope help this as well. The first is we'll often recruit from the active community. So I learned this from Flickr, actually. Flickr, when they moved away from being an online game to a photo sharing service, because that's the bit of the product that got traction, what Flickr did is they very quickly hired the people that loved that service the most, and they made them community managers. So that's something that I've certainly done. We pull our community managers from the community. They're people that we think the community aspire to, and we think that they actually stay true to the community even more. And then the second thing, which interested to know if you do this, is we ensure that everyone in our organization uses the product. And that includes finance, that includes recruiting. Absolutely, in my opinion, everyone in any organization should use the product. It sounds obvious, but I did a talk for a big bank recently, and only about half of the sort of C-suite, the corporate guys, actually use their own product because they use an alternative, a posh company. So staying true to those two things, I think pulling from the community and making sure they use the product, like almost giving everyone at Kickstarter $100 a year to invest in projects would be a good, fun way to think it through.
So we don't do that, but I think that goes, I would say that goes to staying true. We actually, it was an interesting challenge, right? And I think, as you were describing that, this idea of the having everybody, or intend that everybody uses the product. And our original way of thinking is everyone's going to run a campaign, right? Everyone's going to run a project. And we had started talking about that and came to realize that wasn't exactly a necessity. Not to say that they shouldn't be using the product, but I think the greater reflection, and this is more for me now that you've described this, is in what way, right? Everybody in the company is constantly backing projects. And so having that, again, emotional empathy for connecting with the people that are running campaigns. And interestingly enough, what we actually have ended up seeing very naturally within the organization, and I love the fact that it was just natural, not something that we had to, say, architect in. One of the designers on my team he does a lot of sort of side projects, and that's actually something that I suggest quite a bit as a learning experience, and then bring it back into the company. And one of those side projects they actually launched as a campaign. Ironically, it didn't succeed as a campaign, but it was interesting because he then took that very visceral experience and wrote this massive set of notes, shared it with us, and it actually instigated a lot of conversation, a lot of iteration through the product, and it's still having impact. And we see that on and off throughout the cycle of the company. I think it's ultimately what we're looking for. Again, this goes back to this purpose and intent, and then focusing on people. It's not a forced behavior to say we're looking for somebody that's going to run a Kickstarter campaign, but knowing that they come from that world where they're making things and they have this energy to make things, or they're connected to the networks of making people who make things, those creator networks, if you will, like the maker fairs and so forth, and whatever the community may be. One of our support guys, similar to your story, came from the community. He was an illustrator. He was a comic book writer, and he had published a comic on the site. And originally, the thought was, should he be an illustrator for us? We actually don't. If you've looked at the site, we don't do a lot of illustration, so maybe that didn't work. But that's actually one of the dreams. Like, we actually have somebody who's producing something that we can even value. Again, that point of empathy and understanding of what they do. It doesn't even matter what division or what bubble within the organization that they live within. They have something to offer outside of that.
So one of the sort of bring us on to our final point that we wanted to share in a second, but one of the things we both believe in, I think, is that actually any startup is as good or as bad as the people in it. Because in a fast-changing world, it's the people that drive the change, the adaptation of the startup. So quick question for you is, how do you recruit? How did you hire for people that kept that purpose true? You know, what was the process of recruitment? Like, we're notorious at IDEO, and now with my Open IDEO and OI engine, we're notorious for having like 10 interviews to try and get cultural fit or purpose fit. So how about you guys? How did you do that?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I think when we first started talking about this, it was at a conference we were talking a bit about process, and I'm not really a process-focused guy. I tend to look at things fairly casually, but there's obviously an intent or some sort of overarching structure. I think the piece we talked about, you know, for the company right now, we're 68, 70 people, and that is not that large for a company that's been around for four and a half, almost 5 years. We see people within our realm that are at our scale, if you will, which is a whole other topic, that are usually significantly larger. And I think one of the things that we've always aimed to do is grow in reflection of the community, grow intentionally, and sometimes that means grow slowly, right? So culture is always at the heart of it. I think the point that we're both sort of making in terms of purpose, intent, and culture at the heart of it, the only way that you can really ensure that these things are consistent over the course of decades, I think, is really take measured steps. And again, I think it goes back to your point earlier in terms of vanity metrics. It's not really about having them talk to 10 people. It's not about over-architecting what you're trying to get out of the person. I think it's ultimately having a connection with them. I tend to do long conversational interviews. Mine are more conversational. It's more trying to get at a sense of who they are as a person. They're in the interview because they can do a good job.
So I guess often it's said kind of hire slow, fire fast. I don't really like the fire fast bit.
So should we get into the whole jargon thing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the hire slow bit, I think what's interesting is what you're saying is hiring the right people is the handbrake on the business, and that's okay. And actually, probably one of the biggest reasons startups fail, if you guys read the Startup Genome Report, you will read that the reason startups fail most often is premature scaling. It's this idea that people just throw more fuel to a business before it's ready, before it has product market fit, or they hire the wrong people. And so thinking of like hiring and the people as the natural pace setter, the progress, I think is a really interesting.
I think one of the things that we were talking about earlier today and yesterday was even in the realm, I was joking earlier about this idea of jargon, right? Like we're sort of attracted to the new, whatever the new term is that we can latch on to, right? Hire fast, fire faster, whatever it may be. I don't know about you, but I don't really enjoy firing people. I don't like doing it. I never want to do it. And it's the fastest way to deplete culture or trust within an organization. And so I think taking pace is good, but you know, I think the other piece, and I think going back to purpose and intent, we haven't even touched on the world of milestones or you know, the sort of sport of fundraising, if you will, right? And I think there's so much conversation around what's, you know, usual topics of what's your next round and how much did you raise, and I tend to personally find that somewhat irrelevant. Do you own a home?
It's even worse. Like I remember celebrating funding rounds, and for sort of an hour you celebrate massively, and then you realize, oh my gosh, I now have to deliver. It's like I've made a social contract and actually a literal contract with someone to deliver. So it's actually not the end of a journey. It's almost a sort of, you can stop and smell the flowers a bit, but actually the hard work is just beginning. And
I like that. I think it's certainly something to celebrate, but it's not the achievement. You're barely there, right? There's this common thread that I've noticed over the last year when talking to larger corporations and people who work in larger corporations. The usual question is, well, how do you guys do this? How do you do that? What's your process? And they're trying, basically the underpinning of it is, how do we be agile, or how do, and they're missing the point, right? They're trying to be. We were joking yesterday, right? We both have young kids, and we noticed that our daughters are trying to grow up, right? And I'm almost 40, so there's for me this reflection of, oh, I'm losing my youth, right? And I think the same reflection goes for companies as well. Startups, I hope, want to be mature organizations at some point. And mature organizations, basically large corporations, usually want to find their youth again. And I find that to be slightly impossible. There is no fountain for that. But there are protective measures, perhaps, that one can take when building that early company and thinking about those decisions that you make early on that are going to impact you when you get larger. And I think part of that getting larger is, should you get larger, right? Are you content with where you are as a business?
I love that concept. Like, the sort of tweet is, startups should be age appropriate.
Yeah.
Like, too often we're all trying to sort of half behave like a large organization at the wrong stage. But one thing that we've talked about in the past around scaling, we've talked about how premature scaling is the thing that kills startups. So before product market fit, before you've got the right people, before you've hired the right people, you try and scale aggressively. And the problem is you get loads of noise in that. You get loads of, it's too difficult to stay focused on the purpose and learn, because actually you're trying to do a horrible job for many people. But that's quite different. We're not saying it's not important to scale. It is important, but it's important to scale at the appropriate time. And that's when you've got this good foundation of a business that you can feel confident you can, increase by an order of magnitude without ruining your life.
No, absolutely. I mean, we think maybe we're a slightly different organization just because of our business model, but our pace is completely manageable, and it's actually quite lovely as an experience for us running and building the business, and then that allows us to reflect in terms of internal culture, external culture, and our hiring practice. So how do you guys hire? You're saying there's sort of these 10 steps or 10 layers or what have you.
10 is kind of an extreme version, but one thing I believe in is, very quickly, we fundamentally believe in doing rather than talking. And so to reflect that in the interview process, we ask people to do stuff. We ask people to bring artifacts, to make things. Even if they're HR, make a press release advertising a job, show us how it works. And I think this general belief that we all need to make more and talk less, and that should be reflected in the HR, that should be reflected in recruiting. So that's something we consistently do. We ask people how they would change our product. We ask people what they like, what they don't like. And if people are not active users of our product at the point that we interview them, we won't interview them.
I think it becomes clear, right? It becomes clear. I love that point, actually. We've done much the same, and there's in the design world, there's a lot of apprehension about that. It's sort of around spec work and so forth. And usually what I say and how I reflect on it is, like, I don't really care about the end thing that you make. It's not about it being a beautiful thing or a usable thing. I'm not going to take the idea. We've probably had the idea of 15 ways of Sunday, but the interesting thing that comes out of that is the conversation, the debate. How do you handle challenge? How do you, again, it gets back to that empathy. How do you try the best that you can to sort of mimic a real environment? And I think at the heart of that point, what is the plot, and not losing the plot, which goes back to this whole point of purpose. And I think speaking specifically about hiring and looking for and building a team, the plot is really around building a team, building relationships with people. I want to actually have a conversation with somebody. I'm not trying to put them in a scenario that is false. An interview is typically a fairly false environment. It's not really real. So how do you try to make that real, which I think is what I reflect on your point about giving them some challenge and having them write a press release if that's what they're coming in to do.
Cool. So we have just under 10 minutes left, and I'm hoping, the Wi-Fi isn't working for us up here, but I'm hoping there's some questions that may have come in, which you'd be welcome to ask either of us.
How does this work?
You can choose. Charles, when will the Kickstarter be available to Austrian startups? That's been a topic
Next question.
around.
So let's take number 2 then. so how did you know you were ready to scale? I think it's a world-class question, whoever contributed that. So I'll chip in and maybe you follow. So for me, the point you know when you're ready to scale is that you have repeatable sales to a customer group or a user group that represents a big enough market and they see real value. So some people would call that product market fit, but it's unbelievably important not to go too early. Some people will have product market fit with one strange outlier customer and then assume they can just sort of scale a massive business on that. So the question you have to ask is, are we creating something of value, ideally that people pay for? Are we able to repeat it? So do customers come back more than once? And thirdly, does that customer represent a big enough group that we can build a great business? So that would be my 3.
Yeah, I think for us, we've had a fairly unique, I think, experience with regard to the question that I can no longer see anymore. Around scale. How do you know when to scale? For us, it was very organic. So there was never any drive for us to grow Kickstarter bigger than what it's been. It sort of had, I said earlier, a life on its own. It's always been focused on effectively word of mouth. Somebody's going to have a really great experience running a campaign. They were actually able to deliver that project. And from that experience, it turns other people onto it. And so that was inherent in just the user experience of the platform. And so this idea of scale, I think the way I would sort of internalize it in reflecting on the question was really more around how do we scale the business in reflection of, or the team in reflection of the community. And that was just fairly natural. We saw that there were bottlenecks within the organization, and that rotates around the organization. Sometimes it's customer support, sometimes it's design, sometimes it's engineering. The moment that engineering is not the bottleneck, suddenly design's the bottleneck. Design doesn't become the bottleneck, suddenly engineering is the bottleneck. And I think reflecting on those moments and having some patience with those moments and saying, is this an operational problem that we're running into? Are we making decisions poorly? Can we be more effective as leaders and founders of the company in terms of how we make decisions with regard to where we should scale? Or is it truly something where we need to hire somebody to sort of patch that scale issue?
Cool. So we've got them on here, actually. We can pick a few.
Fancy.
So there was another great one I loved around hardware startups are difficult to validate. And actually, I guess Kickstarter, for me, is probably one of the best ways of validating a market for a hardware product than you will ever have. It's effectively pre-launch validation that you have a market. Some other things that we do as a business to validate markets. One is we will often do something that Zinger would call ghetto testing, which is we will actually put out in the world advertisements for products that don't exist yet to measure demand. And you can use it to hone in on your sort of points of sale, your marketing communications. So I think even if you're even if you have a hardware startup, you can use digital tools to validate the market before it's ever made. And the great thing about that process is you learn about the trigger points that customers care about, so you actually launch with a better marketing strategy. And then Kickstarter, I think, is a great example. Anything?
We certainly play in that realm. So now we have this question about we all need to make more and talk less. What should a CEO make? It's actually an interesting question, right? I think when you're starting a company, are you really a CEO? right? And I think for the three of us, and Perry is our CEO, or was our CEO, and he's an artist and a maker. And so the three of us sort of come from that background. Yancey was a writer, and I'm a designer and a musician. And so we have this sort of shared quality. In those days, you are actually making. We're all contributing to that process. And then at some point, there's sort of I suppose the evolution to like a traditional CEO. You actually have an organization. You have to look for healthcare. You're then making a company. So it's a different thing. It may not be a physical thing. It may not be a visceral thing. I would argue that much of, at least in this room, and if we're talking about digital startups, that outside of hardware stuff, if it's software, that's not necessarily a visceral, real thing. I mean, you can touch it and interact with it, but I think there's a strong similarity, right? So and I think a lot of what we've talked about in reflection of us as designers and our application, we're not talking about aesthetics or skeuomorphism here. We're actually talking about how that relates to businesses. And so I think that same evolution happens.
So a couple of builds on that. I completely agree. So the CEO's unit of design is a whole company, but that does not mean they need to make a completely separate company to show that they're makers. An approach Amazon use, which really inspires me, they call working backwards. And what they do at the start of any project, they'll write a press release. Before they've written a line of code, they will write a press release describing what the benefit is as though they've just launched it. And I think that is a design opportunity for the CEO. The CEO should be writing descriptions of what the company will be in the future. They should be taking their values and actually expressing it, designing it into, for example, investor communications. So like investor communications for Kickstarter should have a sense of craft and art because that's the purpose. So designing through that lens feels so important.
I've been fascinated by that Amazon example for the last few years. It blows me away. I've never done it before, but it's interesting sort of starting at the end point and we're engineering backwards.
And if you can't describe the benefit at the end point, don't start the project.
It's
Too
great.
often we start writing lines of code and we measure progress on lines of code or number of pivots or amount of money we've raised without remembering actually if it's not creating real human value and we can't articulate it, it's wasted effort.
So this question's kind of interesting for me personally, I guess. How important is university graduation in your opinion? I don't think it's a matter of that is not the end goal. And I think that's actually, there's sort of an underlying theme here perhaps for the conversation is like what is the actual intent? What's the purpose of going to school is to learn. But the funny thing is, I think what we've come to, what I tend to reflect on is you're not done learning the moment you're out. You actually don't know much, right? You've not actually worked. So I actually dropped out of engineering school. I don't think that's all in and of itself an interesting story. It just so happened to be what decision I made. It's not why I'm sitting here. Perhaps why I'm sitting here is because I reflected on what I do well and focused on what I do well and worked with some other brilliant people. And so I think, is it that you should quit university and go work or make things or do a startup? That's a very personal question that I think is you graduated. You have a piece of paper. You have a degree, right? Yeah. And so we're both sitting here up on stage. So I don't think it matters. I think it's just a very personal thing. I don't think there's a specific route.
Yeah, I would ask: is it the most efficient way to achieve your goals? So if your goal is actually to be a front-end designer on a emerging startup, university might not be the most practical and efficient way for you to build those skills. If your goal is to find an industry you care about, doing an MBA might be a great approach because you'll sample many industries. So kind of depends what you want to achieve.
Ultimately, I think the one thing that I would say is there's no shortcuts in life.
All right. That's an excellent quote to thank Charles Adler and Tom Hulme with. Please give them a big hand.